My name's Joanne Mercer, and I'll never forget the night I thought my heart was about to give out. I was sitting alone at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of medical bills that seemed taller every time I looked. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I read the total over and over, almost like the numbers might magically shrink if I blinked hard enough. But they didn't. The paper still said $68,000 money I needed for surgery in the next 3 months. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe, and please tell me and others what's one life lesson everyone should hear before it's too late. Share it in the comments below. Thanks. The doctor had told me straight, without it, my chances of living were like flipping a coin. As I sat there, a sharp pain twisted in my chest. I pressed my hand against it, praying it was just another anxiety attack. But deep down, I knew it was my heart reminding me that time was running out. Scared and desperate, I picked up the phone and called Marcus, my only son. I raised him by myself after his father walked out when he was just 5. He answered on the third ring, the sound of a sports game blaring in the background. I almost hung up right then. I could already tell he wasn't in the mood for what I was about to say. But I swallowed my pride and told him. I said I needed help, that this wasn't some small thing, that I needed heart surgery or I was going to die. He sighed, long and slow, and his voice had that edge of annoyance. Mom, we've been over this. We have our own bills. We can't just pull money out of thin air. I tried to explain. I'd already sold everything I could. My jewelry, my car, even the piano his grandmother left me. This was the only thing left to ask for. He went quiet, and I pictured him sitting on that tan sofa I helped him pick out when he and Sarah first moved in, staring at the TV while my life was slipping away. I reminded him of all I'd done, how I paid off the mortgage on the house he was living in, how I even signed it over to his name because he said it would help with a loan. I thought maybe he'd remember that and feel some gratitude, but all he said was, "I can't help you, Mom, I'm sorry." Except he didn't sound sorry. He sounded like he just wanted me off the phone so he could get back to his evening, and then he hung up. The silence in that kitchen was heavier than anything I've ever felt. I stared at the phone, my thumb hovering over redial, but I couldn't bring myself to call again. I sat there wondering if I had done something to make him resent me so much. Nothing made sense. I thought of all those years I worked extra shifts at the pharmacy to pay his college tuition. All the times I went without new clothes, without vacations, because he always came first. And now, when I needed him most, he couldn't be bothered. The pain in my chest was still there. I leaned forward, elbows on the table, breathing the way the nurse once told me to. For a moment, I thought about calling an ambulance, but then, the thought of the bill stopped me cold. Imagine that, being afraid to save your own life because you can't afford it. I looked at the clock. It was 8:47 p.m. when it hit me that no one was coming. Not Marcus. Not Sarah. No one. I thought about my grandkids, Eli and Zoe, who didn't even know their grandma was sitting alone, fighting to breathe. I thought about calling my sister Carol, but she lived in Florida, and we hadn't spoken in 2 years over something so small I couldn't even remember what it was. I thought about calling the pastor from my old church, but I couldn't stand the idea of explaining that my own son had turned me away. I didn't want pity. I just wanted Marcus to care. The pain eased a little, so I forced myself up. I opened the cupboard and pulled out the last can of soup I'd been saving. As it heated on the stove, the steam peeled the label right off, and I told myself if I could just get through the night, maybe I'd figure something out. I sat back down with the soup and opened the hospital envelope again. Their payment plans still demanded almost $30,000 upfront money I didn't have. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped a spoon. Every bite felt like sawdust. And, through it all, I couldn't stop hearing Marcus's voice in my head, the calm way he said no. Like my life meant nothing. I picked up my phone again and scrolled through old photos. There was Marcus on his graduation day, Sarah holding baby Eli, all of us smiling in front of the house I spent my whole life saving for. I remembered the pride I felt the day I handed Marcus those keys, how he hugged me and swore he'd never forget what I'd done for him. But looking at him now, I realized he had forgotten. My chest tightened again, and I knew I couldn't just sit there waiting for someone to swoop in and save me. I finished my soup, rinsed the bowl, and set it on the rack. My eyes wandered around the kitchen, the outdated cabinets, the stack of coupon flyers I kept for when money got tight. That's when I decided I wasn't going to die in that chair, waiting for Marcus to suddenly do the right thing. If he wouldn't help me, then I'd help myself. I went to the cabinet and pulled out the old file box where I'd kept every important paper since the day I bought this house. I carried it to the table, ignoring the ache in my arms, and opened it. Inside were mortgage statements, the letter from the bank congratulating me when I finally paid it off, and the deed with my name, my husband's, and later Marcus's. He said it would help him qualify for a better loan. My fingers stopped on the paper that proved the truth. This house was still mine. He lived there because I let him. And in that moment, something inside me went quiet. My fear gave way to a strange calm, like my heart finally understood what I needed to do. I slipped the deed into a fresh envelope and set it beside the hospital bill. I wasn't just a mother begging her son to remember she mattered anymore. Was a woman who would save her own life, no matter the cost. The next morning, I woke up with my chest still sore, like every word Marcus had said had scraped me hollow. But I got out of bed anyway. Sitting around, waiting for him to change his mind, wasn't going to save me. I made a cup of instant coffee, sat at the table, and looked at the deed and the bill side by side like two parts of the same cruel choice. I kept thinking how strange it was. The house I had worked my entire life to pay off was now the only thing standing between me and Don. The very people living in it were the ones who couldn't lift a finger to help. I sipped the coffee, even though it tasted like old pennies, and called the hospital billing office. I asked if there were any charity programs, any last resort options. The woman on the line sounded tired, like she'd given this speech 100 times. She said I'd already received the maximum discount, and without the deposit, my surgery date couldn't be confirmed. I thanked her and hung up, feeling heavier than ever. I imagined Marcus sitting in that house at that exact moment, probably eating breakfast with Sarah and the kids, not giving a second thought to the fact that his mother was fighting just to stay alive. Then, my phone buzzed. For a split second, my heart actually leapt. Maybe it was Marcus, calling to apologize, to say he'd thought it over and he'd help. But it wasn't him, it was Sarah. I almost didn't answer, but told myself maybe she felt differently. Maybe she cared. I picked up and said hello. But before I could say anything, she launched right in, her voice sharp, like I'd ruined her morning just by existing. She said she knew I'd called Marcus last night, that I was making him feel guilty, and that it wasn't fair of me to dump this on them when they had their own bills and obligations. I just sat there, listening, as she rattled off a list. Eli needed braces, Zoe was starting dance classes, Marcus was already stressed. Every word felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. When she finally stopped, I told her, as calmly as I could, that this wasn't about guilt or money, it was about life and death. I reminded her that Marcus was my son, and if he could help even a little, he should. She laughed, short and cold, like she couldn't believe I was still pleading. Joanne, she said, you have to stop acting like we owe you everything. You gave Marcus the house because you wanted to. You can't hold that over us forever. I didn't even know what to say to that. I had never once thrown it in their faces, never reminded them that I had signed over the deed to help them get a better mortgage, that I'd kept paying the property taxes for years because Marcus swore he'd reimburse me when things got better. I finally reminded her of the truth that the only reason they even had that house was because I'd worked 3 jobs just to make the down payment, and she shot back, well, maybe you should have thought about your own retirement instead of trying to be everyone's savior. Her words stung worse than anything Marcus had said. That was the moment it hit me no one was coming to help. Not Marcus, not Sarah, not anyone. I hung up the phone without another word and sat there at the table, my hands resting in my lap, feeling something inside me turn cold. For a few minutes, I even thought about just giving up. I pictured myself closing my eyes, letting the sickness take over, and never having to feel this kind of pain again. But then, I thought of Eli and Zoe. I couldn't let my grandkids grow up thinking their grandmother was weak, that she just gave up without a fight. So I stood up and pulled that old file box from the cabinet again, this time determined. I dug through every folder, every yellowed receipt, every brittle paper I had saved for decades. I wasn't stopping until I found something, and after nearly 2 hours, I did. It was the original deed transfer from when my husband passed, the one that clearly listed me as the primary owner and Marcus only as secondary for mortgage purposes, not as a gift. I read it 3 times, my hands shaking so badly I thought I might tear it, but it was real. That document meant, if I needed to, I could sell the house without Marcus's permission. It felt like the last card I had left to play. I slipped the paper into a clean envelope and tucked it into my purse. Not long after, the phone rang again. I almost ignored it, thinking Sarah was calling to lecture me some more. But when I answered, it was my old lawyer, Miss Cameron, the one who had helped me settle things after my husband died. I'd left her a voicemail the night before, and she was calling me back. Her voice was calm, steady, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel completely alone. She asked me to come in that afternoon to talk over my options. I said yes, before I could second-guess myself. When I hung up, a strange clarity filled the kitchen. I was done begging. If my son wanted to pretend I didn't exist, then fine, he could figure out how to live without the house I built for him. I gathered the hospital bills, the deed, and a folder full of tax receipts and property papers, and stuffed them all into a tote bag. I didn't bother changing out of my house dress or putting on makeup. I was too tired to care what anyone thought anymore. On the bus ride to Miss Cameron's office, memories flooded me. The times I skipped meals so Marcus could go on field trips. The Christmases I went without gifts so he wouldn't feel like the poor kid in class. And now, here I was, riding public transit because I'd sold my car just to afford medication that still wasn't enough to save me. The anger I felt wasn't sharp or explosive, it was slow, heavy, like hot coals burning steady inside my chest. At the office, the receptionist didn't even look up as she slid a clipboard toward me. My handwriting shook as I filled out the forms, but it was still legible. When they finally called me back, Miss Cameron greeted me with the same kind smile I remembered from 20 years ago. But I didn't waste time on small talk. I told her exactly what I needed: to know my rights, how fast I could sell the house, and what it would mean for Marcus and his family. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she took a deep breath and said, "Joanne, you are the legal owner of that property. You have every right to sell it. The only hurdle will be the eviction timeline if they refuse to leave." Hearing those words felt like 1,000 pounds had been lifted from my shoulders. For the first time, I knew I wasn't powerless. Miss Cameron warned me it wouldn't be easy, that Marcus and Sarah might fight me, maybe even try to make me look unstable. But I told her I didn't care anymore. I'd spent my whole life putting Marcus first. Now, it was my turn. As I signed the first set of papers, I felt two things at once: grief and relief. Grief that it had come to this, that the boy I loved more than anything could abandon me so easily. But also relief, because I finally had a plan. When I walked out of that office, I wasn't proud or triumphant. I was tired. But beneath the exhaustion, there was something steadier, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, I still had a chance to save myself, even if it meant letting go of the last illusions I had about my family. The morning after I signed the first papers to sell the house, I woke up with a heavy feeling, like I'd crossed a line I could never go back from. Even though I'd felt sure in the lawyer's office, a small part of me still hoped Marcus would call and say he understood why I had to do it. But he didn't. No call, no text, no sign. He cared that I was about to sell the only home his kids had ever known. I got dressed slowly, noticing how much weaker I was than the woman I used to be, someone who could work all day, then come home and cook dinner without breaking a sweat. My chest felt tight, not just from being sick, but from the painful truth that nothing between me and Marcus would ever be the same. Around 10, Miss Cameron called to say she'd written up the notice to move out. Once the house was under contract, Marcus and Sarah would have 30 days to leave. My stomach twisted at the thought of sending that letter, but what choice did I have? The hospital had already called twice that week, reminding me my surgery date was close and they needed money up front. Every voicemail felt like the walls were closing in. Selling the house was my only way to make sure I'd live to see another Christmas. So, I told Miss Cameron to send the letter. As soon as I hung up, my palms grew sweaty. I knew Marcus would see it as an attack, and I knew he'd twist it into some story where I was the bad guy. But after all his silence, I was past the point of caring what he thought. Around lunchtime, the phone rang again. When I saw his name, my heart jumped so hard I had to hold on to the counter. I picked up, trying to sound steady, but the first thing out of his mouth was, "What the hell are you doing, Mom?" His voice was sharp, almost disgusted. He didn't ask about my health, or if I was scared about surgery. He only wanted to know how I could betray him like this. I told him I didn't have a choice, that I needed the money to stay alive. that I had asked him for help and he'd made it clear he wasn't going to, but he wouldn't hear it. He accused me of being spiteful, of trying to punish him because he couldn't magically come up with the money. I reminded him it wasn't magic. I'd been the one paying the mortgage, the taxes, He and Sarah lived there rent-free for almost 10 years. They might have painted the walls or replaced a carpet, but that didn't change the fact that the house had only been theirs because I made it possible. For a moment, he went quiet, and I thought maybe something had finally gotten through. But then he said, "If you go through with this, I swear you'll never see my kids again." His words hit me like a punch. Eli and Zoe were the only family who still looked at me with love, not pity. The thought of losing them nearly broke me. But then I thought about the hospital bill, about the way my chest felt like it was tightening more each day. This wasn't about pride. It was about survival. I told Marcus, in a voice I barely recognized, that if he wanted to use his kids to punish me, that was his burden, not mine. Then I hung up before he could say another word. My hands shook so badly, I almost dropped the phone. I had to sit down, staring at the countertop, feeling frozen. After a while, I pulled myself together. I gathered the papers I needed for the realtor, the deed, the tax receipts, the hospital estimate, and slid them into a folder. I sipped some water to calm my stomach. On the bus ride to the realtor's office, all I could think about was every sacrifice I'd made over the years to give Marcus a better life. I kept thinking about all the little things I'd done for Marcus over the years, the late nights, sewing patches on his jeans so he wouldn't feel embarrassed at school, or the time I drove 3 hours to pick him up from college when his car broke down, even though I had to be at work at 6 the next morning. I told myself back then that doing those things meant he'd always be there when I needed help. But sitting with that folder on my lap, I realized none of it had guaranteed anything. When I walked into the realtor's office, a woman named Karen greeted me with a warm smile and a handshake. She seemed kind, but I didn't want kindness or pity. I just wanted this to be over. She carefully explained the process of listing the house, the timeline, what buyers might expect. I listened closely, not wanting any more surprises. When she asked if I wanted to stage the house, I shook my head. "Sell it as it is," I told her. I wasn't about to spend another dollar or another ounce of energy making things easier for Marcus at my expense. By the time I signed the papers, my hand was shaky, but it was done. Karen promised a photographer would come by within the week, then handed me a folder of copies to take home. On my way out, I paused by the door as a wave of grief hit me, like I was burying something I'd spent my whole life building. But I kept walking because there was nothing left to save. When I got home, I set the folder on the kitchen table and sat in the same chair where I'd first realized I had to fight for my life. My phone buzzed, and this time it was Sarah. I let it go to voicemail. I was too exhausted to hear her call me heartless. A few minutes later, I played the message on speaker. Her voice was flat and cold as she said they'd hired a lawyer, that this wouldn't be easy, and that they'd make sure everyone knew what kind of mother would throw her son and grandkids onto the street. I listened until the message ended, then sat in the quiet, feeling like I'd officially become the villain in Marcus's story. It hurt more than I wanted to admit, but I also knew I couldn't stop, not now. My whole life, I'd believed my only worth came from sacrificing for others. But sitting there, with my heart beating unevenly, I finally understood the truth. It wasn't selfish to want to live. It wasn't cruel to demand what was mine. I knew the next weeks would be rough, showing up angry, Sarah calling nonstop, maybe even Eli and Zoe hearing lies about me. But I also knew that every day I let their guilt silence me was one less day I might have left. So I called Miss Cameron and asked her to send me the next steps. When I hung up, something inside me settled, not peace exactly, but determination. I was done being the mother who always gave in. I was Joanne Mercer, and I was going to save my own life if it was the last thing I did. The following week dragged on, each day bringing another sign that Marcus and Sarah were digging in their heels. By the time Karen called to say the photographer was scheduled, I was already drained. Still, I told her to go ahead. There was no turning back now. That morning, I sat at the kitchen table, checking off every document Miss Cameron had sent me to prove I was the rightful owner. My hands trembled as I flipped through the papers, remembering Marcus's voice when he threatened to keep the kids from me so casual, like he was talking about returning a sweater instead of cutting me out of their lives. By noon, I got a notification that the certified mail had been delivered. Less than 20 minutes later, Marcus's name lit up my phone. I let it ring, afraid that if I answered, I'd say something I couldn't take back. He didn't leave a message, but Sarah did. Her voice was sharp, almost breaking, as she said they weren't moving and that if I thought any judge would side with an old woman kicking her family out, I was delusional. I deleted the voicemail before it ended, then I just sat there, holding the phone, breathing through the ache in my chest. I knew I should have called Miss Cameron right away to tell her about the threats, but I was too drained to talk to anyone. Instead, I set the phone down on the counter, poured a glass of water, and just stood there, staring at the sink, trying to remember a time when Marcus's voice didn't make my stomach twist in knots. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder in front of me, going over the deed and tax receipts again and again, like if I read them enough times, I'd finally believe I really had the right to do this. Around midnight, I made up my mind I'd go to the house myself, not to argue with Marcus, but to check one last place for the will. I knew there was a copy somewhere with the final page showing the notary seal, proof the house was mine. The only place I hadn't looked was the old file cabinet in the garage. I put on my thick sweater, laced up my walking shoes, and grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. My hands were clammy as I picked up my purse and keys. I told myself I was just going to search, not confront anyone. The bus ride felt endless. The whole way, I kept picturing the door opening and Eli or Zoe standing there. I didn't want them to see me like this, sneaking around in the middle of the night, so I decided to go straight to the garage. The house was dark, except for a light glowing in the upstairs bedroom where I knew Marcus and Sarah slept. A dull ache hit me as I stood in the driveway, remembering all the nights I'd carried groceries or birthday presents through that same door. I slipped through the side gate. It was still unlocked and eased into the garage. The file cabinet was against the far wall. When I tugged the drawer, it stuck, screeching like nails on metal. I froze, holding my breath, waiting to hear footsteps inside. But the house stayed quiet. One by one, I flipped through the folders. Insurance papers, old tax returns, maintenance records. Finally, near the back, I found a thick envelope with my name written in black marker. My heart pounded so hard I had to sit down on the folding chair. I opened the envelope with shaky hands, and there it was, the will. I flipped to the last page and almost cried when I saw the signature and notary seal. Proof the house was legally mine. Proof Marcus couldn't stop me from selling. Relief flooded through me as I slid it back into the envelope and tucked it into my purse. I was just about to stand when a soft voice said, "Grand." I spun around, almost dropping the flashlight. Eli was standing in the doorway, his dinosaur pajamas rumpled, his hair sticking up every which way. He looked so much like Marcus at that age, it made my throat close up. I forced a smile. "Hey honey, I was just looking for some old papers." He didn't move, just stared at me. Then he asked quietly, "Are you mad at Daddy?" I swallowed hard. How could I explain any of this to a 14-year-old without sounding like the villain? I told him I wasn't mad, just hurt, and that sometimes grown-ups had to make hard choices to take care of themselves. He shifted from one foot to the other, like he was deciding whether to call for Marcus. Then, in a voice so soft I barely caught it, he said, "Daddy said you don't love us anymore." That nearly broke me. I covered my mouth so I wouldn't start sobbing. After a moment, I managed to whisper, "That's not true. I love you, and Zoe, more than anything, but loving you doesn't mean I can let myself die just to keep things easy for everyone else." He didn't answer. He just blinked at me with those wide, sad eyes, then turned and went back inside. I stood on shaky knees, closed the cabinet, and slipped out through the side door. As I walked down the driveway, the envelope heavy in my purse, I told myself I'd done the right thing if it didn't feel like it. On the bus ride home, I clutched it to my chest like it was the only proof I wasn't completely alone. When I got back to my apartment, I laid it on the table and called Miss Cameron. I told her I'd found the missing page. She sounded relieved and promised it would make things easier if Marcus tried to fight me. She said she'd draft a statement, verifying the document's authenticity. I thanked her, and after I hung up, I finally let myself cry. Not because I regretted it, but because it hurt so much that it had to come to this. I kept thinking about Eli standing there in the garage, asking if I was mad. I wished more than anything that I could make him understand I never wanted it to come to this. I would have given anything for a different way. But as I sat there wiping my face, I knew the truth. No matter what Marcus said or how many threats Sarah made, I was running out of time. I had to keep going, even if it meant shattering what little was left of my family. I picked up the folder again and looked at the last page of the will. My husband's signature curved across the paper in that familiar way that once made me feel safe. I whispered into the empty kitchen that I was sorry. Sorry it had come to this. But sorry didn't change the fact that I needed to survive. If Marcus wanted to make me the villain, I would carry that weight. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my phone, knowing I had to call Miss Cameron. I needed to tell her everything, including that Eli had caught me in the garage. But I kept hesitating, still hoping that maybe Marcus would call and say he understood. By noon, it was clear no apology was coming. So I dialed her number and told her flatly that I had the document, and that Marcus and Sarah would probably accuse me of trespassing. The truth is the truth, I said, and I meant it. She promised to draft an affidavit to cover the timeline, just in case, and reminded me not to engage with them directly. That almost made me laugh. I knew Marcus he wouldn't sit quietly at home. He'd want to show up and try to bully me face to face. I was right. That afternoon, just as I finished microwaving some leftover soup, there was a loud knock at my door. I peered through the peephole and saw Marcus, jaw tight, arms crossed, like he was there to deliver some final ultimatum. For a moment, I thought about pretending I wasn't home. But then I remembered all the times I'd swallowed my pride for the sake of peace, and how it had only ever made me smaller. So I opened the door and looked him straight in the eye. He didn't even say hello. The first words out of his mouth were, "You broke into my house." I told him calmly it wasn't his house, it was mine, and I had every right to get my own documents. He shook his head like I was completely unreasonable. "You know what you're doing to us," he said. "You're destroying everything." I told him I was just trying to stay alive, that none of this would have been necessary if he'd been willing to help, even a little, but he didn't want to hear it. He just kept saying I was selfish, that I was tearing our family apart. Finally, I cut him off and asked if he'd rather have me dead because that was the only other option. He didn't answer. He just stared at the floor like a sulky teenager. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. I almost faltered then, because I hadn't seen him cry since his father died. But his words broke whatever softness I had left. "I can't believe you'd rather evict your own grandchildren than wait," he said. I told him I didn't have the luxury of waiting, that my heart wasn't going to last while he figured out how to feel like a good son. He went silent again, and in that silence, I realized nothing I said would ever change his mind. So I told him I was sorry he felt that way, but the sale was moving forward. Then I stepped back and closed the door before he could say another word. As soon as the lock clicked, I pressed my hand against my chest. My heart was racing so fast, it scared me. I sat down, breathing slowly until it steadied, then picked up the folder with the will, clutching it like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. That night, Miss Cameron called. The realtor had already received a serious offer on the house, enough to cover my surgery and even leave me a small cushion afterward. I should have felt relieved, but all I could think about was Eli's voice in the garage, asking if I was mad, and whether he'd ever understand that I wasn't doing this to hurt him. I was doing it because I had no choice. Miss Cameron said she'd move forward with the paperwork and reminded me again not to deal with Marcus or Sarah directly. I promised I wouldn't. I knew it wasn't going to be easy, because Marcus was never the type to sit quietly and accept anything. 2 days later, I was proven right. Sarah showed up at my door without warning. Her eyes were red and swollen, like she'd been crying for hours. She didn't even wait for me to invite her, and just pushed past me into the kitchen and blurted out, "You're going to ruin us." I gripped the counter because my legs felt weak, but I tried to stay calm and asked if she wanted to sit down. She ignored me, pacing back and forth like a trapped animal. She said Marcus hadn't gone to work for 2 days because of the stress, and that Eli was having nightmares. Hearing that made something twist inside me, because I never wanted any of this to hurt the kids. But Sarah looked at me like I was the enemy. I tried to explain that I had sacrificed my whole life for Marcus, but she spun around with this sharp, cutting look that made me feel like a scolded child. Then she said words that made my stomach drop. "You think you're the only one who struggled. We're drowning in debt. We took out loans in your name to keep up with the bills. If you sell the house, everything falls apart." For a second, I thought I'd heard her wrong, but then I realized she meant it literally. They had used my credit without asking me. The room tilted. I asked her slowly if she was saying they forged my signature. She didn't deny it. Instead, she broke down crying harder, admitting, "We thought you'd never find out. We planned to pay it off before it mattered." That's when my legs gave out, and I dropped into a chair. My mind raced through every confusing bill, every bank fee, every call from creditors I thought were mistakes. Suddenly, it all made sense. A cold, sharp feeling washed over me like my heart was done making excuses. I told Sarah she needed to leave before I called the police. She looked like she wanted to fight back, but I just stared at her until she finally walked out. When the door clicked shut, I collapsed onto the table and cried harder than I had in years. It felt like everything I believed about my family had been a lie. Later, I pulled myself together and called Miss Cameron to tell her everything. Sarah admitted. She was quiet for a long time before saying I had enough for a criminal case, but all I could think about was Eli and Zoe, the damage it would do if their parents were arrested. So I told her I wasn't ready for that yet, that all I wanted was to make sure the house sale went through so I could afford my surgery and, finally, escape all this. She said she understood and promised to document everything in case I changed my mind. When we hung up, I felt like there was nothing left inside me to even grieve anymore. The next day, Mr. Ortiz, my neighbor, who'd lived across the street for 40 years, called after hearing what happened. He offered to give a statement, saying he'd seen me pay every penny of the mortgage and taxes. His kindness nearly broke me into tears again. He told me he'd known Marcus since boyhood, and he never understood why I let him take advantage of me for so long. I didn't know what to say, because the truth was simple. I had spent my whole life trying to be a good mother. I didn't know how to be anything else. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen thinking about every choice I'd made. Every time I said yes when I should have said no. I taught Marcus it was okay to treat me this way. For the first time, I let myself wonder what my life might have looked like if I'd put myself first, even once. That night in bed, I let myself imagine waking up after the surgery, actually having a future instead of counting down my days. And I made a promise, no matter how ugly things got, I wasn't backing down. This was my life, and I was finally going to fight for it. The morning the house sale was finalized, I sat in the kitchen, the same spot where I'd made every hard decision over the past few weeks. My hands were folded on the table while I waited for Miss Cameron's call. I'd imagined this moment so many times, but when it finally came, I felt strangely empty, like there was no way to walk out of this without scars. My phone rang right on time. Miss Cameron's voice was calm as she told me the buyer's payment had cleared. The check was sent to my account, and that I was officially no longer the owner of the house I had poured half my life into. I thanked her, and even though she didn't say it out loud, I could hear in her voice that she knew this wasn't a happy ending, just the only ending left. After I hung up, I sat still for a long time, staring at the wall. It was like all the anger and sadness had finally drained out of me, leaving only a quiet acceptance that life would never go back to what it used to be. After a while, I got up and walked to the counter. The hospital bill was still propped up against the sugar jar, always there, like a reminder of why I had to push through all of this. I picked it up, and for the first time in months, my hands weren't shaking. That was when I knew I had done everything I could to survive. I called the hospital's billing office. When the woman answered, I told her I was ready to pay in full. There was a long pause before she spoke, and when she finally did, her voice almost sounded relieved. She said, "That's wonderful news, Ms. Mercer." And in that moment, it hit me how rare it must be for her to hear good news like that in her job. As she finished processing the payment, she asked if a family member could come with me on surgery day for support. For a second, I almost lied and said yes, because the truth hurt too much. But instead, I told her honestly that it would just be me, and that I had arranged for a hospital volunteer to help when I was discharged. She didn't say anything else about it, just confirmed the date and time. When I hung up, I felt a strange mix of pride and grief. Pride because I had fought this battle on my own, and grief because every dollar I'd saved, every piece of that house was now gone. All spent just to keep my heart beating. I didn't let myself think too much about Marcus and the kids, because if I did, I knew I'd fall apart. So instead, I kept busy. I put away the piles of paperwork I no longer needed and started making a list of what to bring to the hospital. Then, just around dinner time, there was a knock at the door. When I looked through the peephole, my heart gave that same tired lurch it always did when I saw Marcus. But this time, he wasn't alone. Sarah stood beside him, her eyes red from crying, and behind them was Eli, clutching a paper bag like he wasn't even sure if he should be there. For a moment, I almost didn't open the door. I didn't trust myself to stay calm, but something inside me said I had to face them one last time before the surgery. So I unlocked the door and stepped back. Marcus didn't say anything at first. He just looked around my little kitchen like it was a place he'd never been before. Then, in a voice so soft I barely heard it, he asked, "It's done, isn't it?" I nodded because there was no point pretending. He swallowed hard and glanced at Sarah, who kept her eyes down. Finally, he said, "We came to say we're sorry." I didn't know what to feel. I had waited so long to hear those words, and now that they were here, they felt too late to fix anything. Still, I listened. He admitted he had failed me, that his pride had stopped him from helping the woman who had given him everything. He said he had always believed I'd be there to pick up the pieces, never realizing that one day I would have to choose myself over him. When he finished, the room went quiet except for the sound of Eli shifting nervously by the door. Then, Sarah stepped forward, her voice shaky. She said she was sorry that she had known about the debt and the forged forms, but hadn't tried to stop it because she was scared of losing everything. Then she broke down crying, and it felt like I was watching someone else's family fall apart instead of my own. I turned to Eli. He wouldn't meet my eyes at first, but I told him he had done nothing wrong, that none of this was his fault. He finally looked up and said, "Dad said you hate us." The words felt like a knife in my chest, and I had to close my eyes for a moment to steady myself. I told him it wasn't true, that I loved him and Zoe more than anything, but love didn't mean letting people hurt you again and again. He nodded, like he was trying to understand, even if he couldn't fully. Marcus asked if there was any way to undo what I'd done, if he could take out a loan, or find another way to get the house back. I told him gently that it was too late, that the money was already with the hospital and the surgery was scheduled. He rubbed his hands over his face like he couldn't bear to hear it. And in that moment, I knew this would be the last time we'd all be in a room together like this. No matter what happened with my recovery, there was no coming back from what had been broken. The thought hurt, but at the same time, it set me free. For the first time, I realized I had been carrying all of them on my back for decades. I wasn't strong enough anymore. So I looked at Marcus and told him that I hoped one day he could forgive me, that maybe, someday, he'd finally understand. I didn't make this choice to punish Marcus. I did it because I wanted to save myself. He nodded, but couldn't look at me. Sarah quietly took Eli's hand, and they stepped out into the hall. Marcus lingered for a moment like he had more to say, but in the end, all he managed was, "I hope you're okay, Mom." Then he closed the door, and the sound of their footsteps faded away. I sank into my chair, finally letting out a long breath. There was nothing left to fight over anymore. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I tucked in my robe, my insurance papers, and a photo of me holding Marcus when he was a baby. Even with all the anger between us, I didn't want to forget that once upon a time, we had loved each other without all this hurt. The hospital lobby was quiet when I checked in. When they called my name, fear hit me so hard I had to grip the counter to steady myself. But then I reminded myself how far I'd come, how many nights I'd sat alone in that kitchen and refused to give up. I knew I could face this. As they wheeled me into the operating room, I closed my eyes and whispered to myself that no matter what happened next, I had finally chosen me, and nobody could ever take that away. When I woke up after the surgery, the world was blurry, but I felt this soft wave of relief. I was alive. My heart was still beating. Marcus and Sarah didn't come, but a kind volunteer sat by my side, holding my hand until the nurse came in to check my vitals. When I was discharged, I took a taxi to the small condo I'd rented with the last bit of money from selling the house. Standing in that doorway with my suitcase, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known in years. It was small, but it was mine, and nobody could tell me I didn't deserve to live there. That's today's story. If it touched you, leave a like and subscribe. And don't forget, share your own life lesson in the comments below.